Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I'm a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor, and I'm a writer. I write on my blog, samberg.org. If you want to check that out, you can go there. And my training involves biblical studies, it involves theology, and it involves biblical languages. I want to talk about this book here today, Jesus Contradicted by Dr. Mike Licona. If you want to pick it up, it's pretty cheap. It's like $20 or so on, maybe a little more than that on Amazon. And it's a quick read. It's about 240 pages or so, if you don't want to read all of the bibliographies and all that kind of stuff. And what he's trying to do in this book is he's trying to talk about the four Gospels and why we see inconsistencies in the four Gospels. And his idea that he's chasing down in the book is that the reason we see that is because the genre of the literature is actually ancient biography. First century biography. It's not all this other stuff that it's been ascribed to. So that's his, and he goes at great length to talk about different authors from first century that he's looked at and that are biographers. They did the life of this, the life of that, all these different ancient figures. And he shows that even within the same author, I think Plutarch is who he uses, that even within the same author writing about same events in different lives of people, but that ones that cross and mix, that even with the same author in the biographies, there are inconsistencies in how they report certain things. And so it's really a fascinating take on these four Gospels. He talks about how a majority of scholars have revisited the idea of what the Gospels are and are coming more and more to this idea that they are ancient biographies, that they are not their own genre of things. And so he makes a good case for that. Here's what I will say. There are times in this book where Licona shows off his scholarly work, and he even goes into critical studies, which I think is a really a great position that he takes here. And he takes a lot of different ideas. There are times he comes off as an apologist, and so if you're someone who bucks against that kind of an idea, then just beware as you're reading this that you might be frustrated a couple different times, because of course he's going to read faith and different things into it. He talks about his work that he wrote before this book that was more scholarly, that people felt was a little inaccessible to the layperson. But even at that level, even Bible scholars came back and said, this is not enough scholarly work. And they criticized his usage of different apologetic things. So you need to be aware, take note of that if you're someone who doesn't ascribe to that. If you're not, then it's going to be par for the course to a faithful interpretation of things. Two of the things that I was really interested in this book were chapter 11, where he deals with the idea of inerrancy, and then the appendix. And I'll talk about the appendix in a second, but the chapter 11, when he deals with this idea of inerrancy, he talks about it throughout the book. But one of the things that he kind of harps on is this idea that the traditional stance of inerrancy, something we would find in like the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy, that kind of stuff, just does not work with the Bible. As you read the text, you just get to this point where it's like, this cannot be what is going on in the text of Scripture. He said his guiding principle of how he thinks about things like inerrancy and inspiration of the text is this, and I quote, "Our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture." And I would agree. That is a very important statement. That as we read Scripture, we cannot have a view of the inspiration of Scripture that is in contrast with the Scripture that we're reading itself. Like, if we have a divine dictation version of inspiration, verbal plenary, all this kind of stuff, and then you read Scripture and that's just not what's going on there, it's really hard. You're going to either have to force one into the other one or ignore it. And he uses three different, I think it's in chapter 4, he uses three different ways to look at this. Maybe it's chapter 3. Where is it at? No, it's in chapter 2. He says there, when we see Bible contradictions or see like things inconsistencies in the text, we can have one of three approaches. We can either be an ostrich, which is like nothing to see here, put your head in the sand. We can be the peacemaker and try to harmonize all of those things together in a gentle but still trying to harmonize it way. He said, or we can be a cruel interrogator, and we can bend things and twist things to try to make them say what we want them to say because our version of inspiration dictates that. And he says, no. What we need to do is we need to have a view of Scripture that is consistent with what we observe in Scripture. And so chapter 11, he talks about the difference in what is viewed as traditional inerrancy, which is verbal plenary, almost divine dictation kind of inerrancy and inspiration, versus what he calls flexible inerrancy, which is, he talks about this over and over again. He talks about the fact that that God inspired the writers to become who they were so that they could write spontaneously about what they were writing about, versus, whispering in their ear, telling them what to write. And so instead of, these are like all of God's words here, these are words that have a very human element to them that we would find inconsistencies with, but God has inspired the authors to write what they wrote. And so that's kind of, I think, his position, his take on this idea of flexible inerrancy, being able to say, no, the truth behind what they're writing is what's inerrant, not all of these little things that we find that are ancillary. So, and then in the appendix, this is another part of the book that I thought was interesting as I began to read it. I didn't realize he did this, but in the appendix, he takes about a page and a half, maybe 2.5 pages, to address John Poyer's book, The Invention of the Inspired Text, which I've talked about on this channel before, and his take on the Greek word theopneustos we find in 2 Timothy 3:16. Because if you remember back to videos I've done before, or if you've read the book, you know that Poyer's take is that Origen is the one who creates this idea of inspiration, divine inspiration. He takes the word theopneustos, and he's the first one to do it and talk about it this way. And Licona he's going to rebut this, and he talks about the fact that while that may be partially the case, there's a better case to be made that Tertullian before Origen used theopneustos in the Latin as divina inspirata, and that came before Origen. And so he kind of builds this argument that people were seeing the text of the Old Testament especially as divinely inspired way before Origen coined that. And even if the word was normally used outside of the biblical text as, God breathed, meaning life-giving and all these different kind of things, it seems that the church, the New Testament writers, the people surrounding them used that word, God breathed, specifically in its literal sense, meaning divinely inspired. Which I think is a fair point that Licona is making, because you do see that in Tertullian, and he points to examples of that. I wish that they both would have talked more about, and I think Licona hints at it, but he doesn't really talk about it, the first century rabbinical ideas of the authority of the scriptures, of the Hebrew scriptures. Because there was becoming, and this idea of inspiration may not be the exact word they're using, but you could tell that's exactly what they were meaning when they were talking about the authority of the text. And that kind of was already circulating amongst first century Jewish people, first century Hebrew people. And you could tell that they were already viewing their texts as authoritative, and that just kind of, maybe that was the lens that the writers of the New Testament began to see their texts, the text through. And even as they compared, Peter talks about Paul's text as other scripture, that kind of thing, then maybe they began to see it that way. And that's just where this tradition was passed on. So neither of those authors talk about that, which I think is fascinating, because I think Poyer doesn't do it because they don't use the word theopneustos. So it's like he's kind of tracking that word down and showing what that means. And Licona kind of hints at it, but he doesn't really talk about it in the appendix. So, but I thought I thought it was fascinating that he addressed that book and addressed the idea of inspiration while also attacking the traditional version of inerrancy to go for a more flexible version of inerrancy, which I would call, I don't even think inerrancy is the right word to use anymore. I think you need to use a better word and maybe just go back to inspiration. If you're going to walk away from the statement of inerrancy that they did back in the 79, 78, somewhere around there, then why call it inerrancy? That word kind of no longer, if you're going to walk away from what they defined there, then it's really no longer useful, and let's have a better word and just maybe use inspiration, the inspiration of the text. So anyway, it's a really fascinating book. You should read it for no other reason, just to kind of understand what's going on in scholarship from the confessional side, and you can kind of see the different back and forths of what's going on with this idea of inspiration of the text and gospel differences and all that kind of stuff from multiple vantage points. All right. Well, hopefully this was an informative video. Give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.